Well, I want to start by saying that I am really happy to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak and give a public lecture. I like the idea of talking with a combination of academics and non-academics and interested people about theories of the passions. So this evening, yes, I'm talking on Ruly and unruly passions in the early modern period. And I start, first of all, by talking about the typical scenario. So the sketch is, and I know this is kind of a silly cartoon, but I start by sketching a common way to think of the relation between our passions, reason, and our behavior. Passions often upset us. They overtake us, and they prompt us to do things that we later regret. If we only had paused to think over the situation, we might have acted in a cool-headed and a reasonable way instead. We talk about crimes of passion, like killing a beloved in a fit of jealousy or anger, and we do so because we regard passions as motives, often motives to bad behavior, but of course not always. This picture is intuitively plausible, and it seems to assume that reason can be at odds with passion. It can direct a person's actions and push her toward opposite objectives. Also, on a popular view of value, to act from reason is to act prudently or virtuously or for the sake of morality, while to act on passion is often to be imprudent, reckless, vicious, or at minimum, less than fully virtuous. Those unruly passions can get the best of us. Now, there's a long tradition of support for this sort of view, but my interest is in what the 17th and the 18th century intellectuals, at least up to until Hume's publication of his famous Treatise of Human Nature, 1739 and 40, thought about passion, reason, and action. Now, I want to note that in this presentation, I'm not making a distinction between emotion and passion, and I'll use passion in the way that these philosophers did to refer to particular affective states, many of which can move us to action. Now, in books 2 and 3 of Hume's famous treatise, he takes on the traditional view, and he argues that this view makes no sense of human psychology, given what passion and reason are, or how they function. Among Hume's main theses is the thesis that reason without a passion simply cannot be a motive to action. It's not clear that Hume understood the early modern view correctly, however. A survey of theories on the passions and action in the 17th and the 18th century reveals that few, if any, of the major and minor thinkers explicitly held the view that reason in any of its functions motivates action without a passion. Yet they did hold the general view I just sketched above. The details concerning how passion and action are practically opposed to one another matters a lot here. And so I want to look closely at some of the theories of the passions prevalent in the early modern period, and then later I'm going to return to Hume. It's clear that Hume and his adversaries are operating with different conceptions of what a passion is, and I hope to show that there's something interesting going on in their disagreement. Now, first of all, the entrenched view going back to the ancient philosopher Aristotle replaced gradually in later centuries was that the passions were passive powers of the sensitive part of the tripartite soul. That is, that they were capacities to be affected, and they resided in the part of the mind that reacts to sensible objects outside of us acting on the body. The early moderns offered alternative perspectives that tried to address the relation between the mind and the body and provide a more unified account of the mind than that found in ancient and scholastic thought, while also emphasizing the activity of the passions themselves. That little chart on Aristotle shows how he divides the soul into non-rational and rational elements, where he thinks the rational elements will oversee the non-rational ones, and practical reason interacts with or oversees desire and emotion and nutrition and growth. Now, since the passions influence action on the prevailing 17th and 18th century perspective, They could be useful when controlled, but harmful or misleading when not controlled. Thus, one persistent refrain in the work of these philosophers was the governance of the passions, whether an internal authority, which they usually identified with reason, could oversee the passions, or whether an external authority was necessary, like government, society, other people. Okay. Now, among the philosophers who were preoccupied with this topic and with whose work is very well known to us and to Hume are Descartes, Malebranche, Leibniz, Clarke, and Spinoza, in addition to Hobbes, Locke, Mandeville, and Shaftesbury, not to mention Butler and Hutcheson. Okay. Now, there were also several other 17th and 18th century thinkers who were writing on the oversight of the passions as well. Among them were French philosophers Jean-François Sinon, Nicolas Coeftu, and Marin Carriot de la Chambre, plus English theorists William Ayloff, Francis Bragg, the Vicar of Hitchin, Walter Charlton, and Henry Grove, and also Edward Reynolds. All of these thinkers contributed to some degree to the debate concerning the respective roles of reason and passion in motivation. So now I want to talk more specifically about some of the 17th century theories of the passions. So I'm going to start with some of the early writers on the governance of the passions. The theme that the passions are intimately connected to action and inhabit a part of the soul separate from reason is evident in discussions early in the 17th century. But I start with the question, what is a passion? In 1621, French theologian Nicolas Coeftu, in a table of humane passions, defines a passion as a motion of the sensitive appetite caused by apprehending good or evil and followed by a bodily movement contrary to the laws of nature. Okay. Now, according to Coeftu, the passions do not reside in the rational part of the soul because the purpose of that part of the soul has nothing to do with bringing change to the body. Now, in his Treatise of the Passions and the Faculties of the Soul of Man, first published in 1640, Edward Reynolds, the Vice Chancellor of Oxford University and later the Bishop of Norwich, portrays the passions as natural, perfective motions that humans receive from their Creator for the advancement of their natures. His presumption is that humans have an instilled desire for the good, and the passions enhance human nature by inclining us to good objects or by producing an aversion to noxious ones. Reynolds portrays the dignity or the value of the passions in their being the ministers of reason in the execution of duties which are to the benefit of our nature. The will is a blind faculty on its own, but the understanding serves as its counselor, either to furnish it with an end upon which to fasten, or to direct it to the means to that end, all in accord with the rules of right reason. Okay, now, French philosopher Jean-François Sinon agrees, this is in the Use of the Passions in 1641, he agrees that the passions can be beneficial, and he suggests that the ancient Stoics were just wrong. The Stoics, such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, advocated for the view that the best life is one in which we relinquish our passions and we practice insensitivity to the vicissitudes of the world, since the passions undermine our peace of mind. So that idea was just try to get rid of your passions. Sinon said instead that the passions are useful, but only when governed. And there's not one passion that cannot become a virtue, since all involve natural inclinations to good and away from evil. The governance of the passions, he maintains, depends upon moderation. He added, however, that it's dangerous for one passion to moderate another by its opposition. For example, trying to oppose hope to fear. He says that this would result in fortifying one enemy to destroy another. Moderation instead requires reason. And he says, reason is king over passions. Their government is one of her chief employments. Reason there is feminine for him. Okay. Yet, he says, reason is not sufficient without the grace of God. So reason on its own can't do it. All right. So far then, just a quick summary. Since I started asking, well, what is a passion? So this is what view is coming out of this survey of some of the 17th century thinkers. It's evident that a passion, A, involves a feeling of attraction or aversion to an object. B, it's evoked by an apprehension of good or evil. C, it's distinguished from reason or from reason's operations. And D, it's a normal part of human nature. It's not bad in itself, and it's helpful when it does the bidding of reason, or it's moderated by reason. Okay, now I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about Descartes and Malebranche. So they were interested in reason and the passion's physiology. Okay. So some of the 17th century philosophers were preoccupied with the role of physiology in the production of the passions. Among the ways that the passions originate, according to Descartes, are by our decisions to bring certain objects to mind, by the temperament of the body, and by impressions haphazardly encountered in the brain, as when one feels sad but is unable to say why. With the exception of a few passions, so wonder, esteem, and scorn, pride and humility, veneration and disdain, the passions are produced by an object's being characterized as good or bad for us. As Susan James points out, however, the evaluations of good and harm contained in the passions directed to objects outside the mind are not just out there in the world waiting to be read. She says that they're like secondary quality perceptions. So she says they're like sound, color, taste, and warmth, which may be functions of real qualities in the world that allow us to make discriminations necessary to our well-being. Right? So they're functions of real qualities, but somehow dependent on us. Now, Descartes thinks that the chief effect of the passions is that, quote, they incite and dispose their soul to will the things for which they prepare their body, so that the sensation of fear incites the body to flee, that of boldness to do battle, and so on, he says, for the rest of the passions. Now, on passionate governance for Descartes, while the passions are not under our control, they can be indirectly altered by the representations that are typically joined with certain passions that we will to have. So I need to say something here about the notion of representation. Representations are ideas we have with a cognitive content by which we bring to mind thoughts of objects or states of affairs, so we can represent the world to ourselves. So for Descartes, since the passions can sometimes be produced and altered by thoughts, by representations, the passions can actually oppose reason, since such an opposition is really between passionate representations, he says, and non-passionate representations. So here's an example. For instance, I have a confused thought of something that appears to be an evil, like the evil of a severe sort of medical treatment that I have to go through, along with the volition to avoid or to delay the treatment. So I don't want to go through this. So that constitutes my passion of fear. But that's also pitted against the thought that I'll be much better off and I'll live a longer life by having the treatment done immediately. So we have two kinds of representations opposing each other. So in Descartes' conception, passions are representations of states of affairs as good or evil, and they involve volitions or motives toward the beneficial and away from the harmful. And so you can have clashes of representations. You can have clashes, he thinks, between the passionate and the non-passionate representations, between the feeling state and the reasoning state. Okay, now Malebranche takes over the Cartesian view that willing, imagining, sensing, and so on are modifications of thought. So in his theory, God has implanted in our minds natural inclinations, which are necessary to achieve the variety among minds in the same way that various motions of matter are needed to determine the fact that matter is not just one indistinguishable mass. Among particular inclinations are curiosity, self-love. Self-love, by the way, is manifested in lots of ways, like caring for your well-being, love of grandeur, desire for knowledge, the desire to appear learned to people, an inclination for riches, the love of pleasure, love for things that make us happy. That's all self-love. And then the third inclination is friendship for others. So on Malebranche's view, while our inclinations are naturally directed toward God, they're not always, in fact, so directed, since our will can divert them. So these various natural proclivities are, however, in fact, aspects of our one impulse for the good, so the love of good in general, which is an end instilled by God. So the mind is directed toward this indeterminate and universal good by our Creator. But the mind has freedom, the power to direct its natural inclinations by ordering the understanding to represent particular objects to it. And here's a quote from Malebranche. He says, "A person represents some honor to himself as a good that he might hope for. The will immediately wills this good. That is, the impression toward indeterminate and universal good that the mind is continuously receiving conveys it toward this honor." So we have instances of things that we see as good. And because of this general inclination for the universal good, these instances make us form an attraction to the particulars that are supposed to be examples of the universal good. So like many of the philosophers preceding him, Malebranche holds that the passions can distort our perceptions of good, and his theory offers a physiological explanation of how passions infect our reactions toward related things. Okay, so now just a quick summary of where I've been so far with the 17th century thinkers. So most of the 17th century theorists acknowledged that passions were the original motives to action, even though they needed the guidance of reason to succeed at achieving the good. Much of the language in these early discussions of the oversight of the passions is metaphorical, right? Reason is said to govern the passions by showing them the proper ends, but the details of how the passions then adopt those ends is not so clear. In Descartes, the passions are explicitly characterized as representations, and they frequently misrepresent objects as good or evil by their confusedness or their obscurity. And then on Malebranche's theory, the motivation originates with our natural inclinations, which are directed by God toward the good, but which can get sidetracked by the passions. The inclinations and passions are intellectual, but the passions also have a physiological component that makes them confused but lively. So Malebranche offers a physiological explanations of how the passions infect our thinking and the direction of our actions. So the 17th century philosophers do suggest that ideas of genuine goodness produced by reason oppose the corrupt notions of goodness prompted by the passions. However, it doesn't appear that reason, as a non-effective, thinking capacity, is itself providing an original motive to action in any of these accounts. So the original motive always originates from the passions themselves. So now I want to say something about the 18th century theories of the passions, and then I will eventually get to Hume's response to all of this and raise a puzzle about Hume's response. Okay. So at the beginning of the 1700s, English theologians William Ayloff, Muridorus Berghoff, and Francis Bragg continued to promote the thesis that persons' passions left on their own have a malignant and a destructive effect. In The Government of the Passions According to the Rules of Reason in Religion, Ayloff repeats several themes from Sinon. Let me move on here. Yeah, here we go. That while we can use one passion to repel another, doing so is not safe. That only reason with God's grace can restrain the passions, since reason is obnubulated, which I had to look up this term. I don't know, maybe everyone's familiar with obnubulated, but it means darkened or obscured, obnubulated by original sin, and that the passions are the seeds of virtue. My chief interest here is in the way in which the passions receive reason's guidance. Ayloff says that the soul is slave to the senses, which are deceitful, and they produce erroneous knowledge under whose directions the passions become irregular. Here's a quote: "Our passions are only criminal because they are deceived." You can read that. If you can read that, it's up there. Thus, the passions are not in themselves depraved, but reason must show them their objects in genuine colors, and it serves to remove the objects that tend to promote rebellion and upheaval. Berghoff, in a sermon preached at the Temple Church, also insists that the passions be fixed on their proper objects, which is to say that the passions are meant to glorify virtue and abhor vice. Bragg in 1708 agrees with many of the previous thinkers that it's neither possible nor desirable to root out and destroy a passion, which just are vigorous tendencies toward what we regard as very good and conducive to our happiness, and aversions to what we take to be very evil and pernicious. Good and evil will always affect us, both in this world and in the next. In this world, the passions are also motives to action, which move us through a strong commotion of our blood and our spirits. So in order to be moved in the right way, we have to apply reason and religion to rectify our notions of good and evil and make an accurate estimate of the relative worth of goods. So here's a quote from Bragg. And again, it's up here on the screen. "He that seriously and often thus employs his thoughts will in time become as 'twere dead and insensible to all the false deluding blandishments of wealth and greatness and pleasure, and be got out of danger of being transported by any extravagant degrees of passion in the pursuit of anything here below. Thus, the use of reason with God's assistance will not only enlighten us about what is genuinely good and conducive to our well-being, so that the passions move us according to their intended purpose, but it will also diminish our desires for or our love of mistaken goods, which are the petty pleasures of this life." Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the English theologian Ralph Cudworth. So Cudworth died in 1688, so you might wonder, why am I discussing him with the 18th century philosophers? But his true intellectual system of the universe was published in 1678, but was also published in several editions in the 1700s. And then the treatise concerning eternal and immutable morality was published posthumously, first in 1731, and then a treatise of free will was not published until 1848. For that reason, and because Hume regards Cudworth's views on the origin of morality as significantly similar to Samuel Clarke's, I'm going to discuss Cudworth in the context of 18th century thought, along with Clarke. So Hume notes in the second inquiry not the treatise, which I mentioned earlier, but the second inquiry, which was written much later, that the view that morality consists in necessary relations discovered by reason was first advocated by Malebranche and then embraced by Ralph Cudworth and Samuel Clarke. So Hume famously describes Samuel Clarke's moral theory at a certain passage in the treatise, and then he rejects what he takes to be his and Cudworth's moral rationalism by pointing to the inert nature of reason, which guarantees that reason could not be a source of morality, which is motivating or active on its own. That is, morality is motivating or active on its own. It's supposed to influence behavior. However, neither Cudworth nor Clarke actually thought that rational apprehension of morality or the necessary relations that constitute morality, they never thought that that could move us on its own. One of the Cambridge Platonists, Cudworth, combines a mechanistic, corpuscular explanation of nature with Platonic metaphysics, theism, and a defense of free will. His theory has got a lot of different elements in it. You sometimes wonder how he can put these all together. So Cudworth argues at length in Eternal and Immutable Morality that, I think I will move on here. Yeah, Cudworth's views. He argues at length that just as God's arbitrary commands cannot change the nature of a square into that of a circle, so they cannot make something good or bad, just or unjust. That was not so by nature. He also argues that human minds have all ideas innately because they reflect the mind of God. Knowledge is acquired by an active process of cognition that involves recollection of these ideas, but also sense perception, which, he says, is necessary to acquire knowledge of the order in the external world. Cudworth isn't explicit about how moral knowledge fits into this scheme, but his treatment of morality analogously to geometry in its being composed of necessary, immutable truths implies that they're known in the same way that geometry is known, by our clear and a distinct conception of them. So Cudworth has no discussion of whether or how moral knowledge might affect actions, and passions are never mentioned at all in Eternal and Immutable Morality. So if we assume that he thought apprehension of morality, which is done by reason, could by itself motivate persons, then we could conclude that he thought reason on its own was motivating. However, the view that demonstrative reason was a motive was unorthodox, and Cudworth makes it clear in other writings that he didn't think that. Both John Passmore in his book on Cudworth from the 1950s and a contemporary philosopher, Michael Gill, in his more recent study of Cudworth, contend that Cudworth is more aligned with sentimentalism than with rationalism in his motivational theory. In a sermon that Cudworth preached in 1647, he emphasizes the importance of character and internal motivation to living the religious or the best life. He writes that knowledge is more excellent than riches and outward pleasures, yet our happiness consists in, quote, a certain divine temper and constitution of soul, which is far above it. We think it's a gallant thing, this is another quote, a gallant thing to be fluttering with our wings of knowledge and speculation. But in fact, what is more important and productive of sweet delight is to achieve an inner state of harmony between our will and God's. And then later, Cudworth writes of God's effect on us. God is always kindling, cheering, quickening, warming, enlivening hearts. So there's certainly evidence that Cudworth thought that the motivation to live the best life originated from internal sentiments rather than from reason or knowledge. John Passmore writes about the content of Cudworth's unpublished manuscripts that they show how misleading it is to think of Cudworth as one of Clarke's predecessors, even though I'm discussing them together here as well, whom Passmore characterizes as having the crudest form of rationalist psychology, with reason acting as an impersonal arbiter remote from passion. Okay, I just want to check to see how I am doing on time. Okay. So, just a little bit more about Cudworth, and I'm going to move on to Clarke, and then I'll get to Hume. So, in A Treatise of Free Will, Cudworth, which was published in 1838, I mentioned that, Cudworth puts forward his alternative to faculty psychology with a divided mind. He characterizes the mind as an integration of reason, imagination, passion, and appetite, with contributions from these various sources ordered by the will. Among the features in the soul is an incessant desire, the love of the good, which is the source of motivation. And here's again a quote from Cudworth. He says, "That which first moveth in us and is the spring and principle of all deliberative action can be no other than a constant, restless, uninterrupted desire or love of good as such, and happiness. This is an ever-bubbling fountain in the center of the soul, and a later or spring of motion." And then he says that the will is not free, but it does not decide actions blindly and fortuitously. I'm sorry, I meant to say, he says that the will is free, is not free, but the will is free. That's really important. But it doesn't decide actions blindly. And it's not indifferent to the alternative objects' various degrees of goodness and evil, and so it decides on the basis of deliberation and reasoning. Okay. All right, I am now going to move on and talk a bit about Samuel Clarke. So, in the Boyle Lectures of 1704, which were entitled A Demonstration of the Being and the Attributes of God, Samuel Clarke presents his argument for the necessary existence of God and his description of God's attributes. His defense of free will against Hobbes and Spinoza is also a prominent theme. In his 1705 lectures, entitled A Discourse Concerning the Unchangeable Obligations of Natural Religion, Clarke discusses the source and the nature of morality, which seems to situate him close to Cudworth in that arena. Okay, so according to Clarke, and here's a quote, "There is a fitness or suitableness of certain circumstances to certain persons, and an unsuitableness of others, founded in the nature of things and the qualifications of persons, antecedent to all positive appointment whatsoever." And then he says about these fitnesses that they determine the truths of morality, such as that we should honor and worship God, that we should not defraud our neighbors, and that we should preserve the life of an innocent man. These truths are, in Cudworth's theory, necessary and accessible by reason. Now, it sounds like Clarke is a thoroughgoing rationalist here, right? Like the truths of morality are necessary, they're discernible by reason. So you might think maybe Hume was right to think that some of the philosophers in this period did believe that reason alone is a motive to action. But I have a little bit more to say about Clarke that I think reveals that he didn't think that either. So for reasonable persons, their discernment of these fitnesses does direct their will when the will is not corrupted by passion. And here's one more quotation from Clarke. "And by this understanding or knowledge of the natural and necessary relations, fitnesses, and proportions of things, the wills of all intelligent beings are constantly directed and must needs be determined to act accordingly, excepting those only who will things to be what they are not and cannot be, that is, whose wills are corrupted by particular interest or affection, or swayed by some unreasonable and prevailing passion." So Clarke acknowledges a conflict between reason and passion in suggesting that when we act contrary to reason and so contrary to moral duty, it's because we're either diverted by negligent misunderstandings or by passions like lust or greed. All right, so it looks like the passions are pushing against reason. However, human understanding of demonstrative truth does not by itself lead to action with no contribution from the passions. In his sermon on the government of passions, which was 1710 or 1711, depending on which calendar you follow, in the government of passion, Clarke says, in God, there's no room for passion because reason and understanding are perfect. But in non-rational beasts, passions and appetites are the only motivators. Now look at human beings. Human beings have a middle nature. They have a middle nature between the two. They possess both the passions and reason. And he says, passions and appetites excite and stir people up to action where their bare abstract understanding would leave them to remiss. So he's making the point that people would never get to action if they didn't have the passions. Reason alone does not move us. So he says that it's human person's duty to govern the passions with reason, where, when left alone, the passions would hurry them on to exorbitant and unreasonable things. So, following the theme in earlier writers, Clarke thinks the passions are useful when they're properly directed, and they make us diligent in pursuit of those actions of life with which reason directs and the passions execute. And then Clarke has some interesting things to say about free will. He thinks that free will is the ability to choose to act against our best judgment. So that's an interesting thing to say. You have the freedom to go against the judgments of reason. He's interested in showing that God's actions are not necessitated and they're not arbitrary. They're also done freely from reasons, but human freedom is a reflection of God's freedom. And while the understanding may be determined to assent to a proposition perceived to be true, such assent is not a volition or cause of volition. It's a reason rather than a cause. And to think otherwise is a confusion of moral motives, he says, with physical efficiency. Okay. I think then I can move on to a brief summary of the theses that we've been looking at on passion and action in the early modern writers. So, done a survey of the 17th and the 18th century. By no means have I touched on every philosopher who wrote in that period or who wrote about the passions, but I think it's been an adequate enough survey to get a sense of the views that they are putting forward. So the prominent theses propagated by these early modern philosophers, writers, and clergy, and as you can tell, some of these theses were put forward in sermons, are the following. First, many passions left unregulated lead to the pursuit of unsuitable objects. Generally, underlying this perspective is a teleological view of the universe with certain objects that are proper to our endeavors. On some views, God has instilled in us a desire for genuine good and an aversion to genuine evil, but the passions can derail our pursuits. Second thesis, reason can overcome the pernicious influence of the passions and take control of them in our actions. And on some views, like Sinot's, reason must be supplemented by the grace of God. And the third thesis, the passions are not self-regulating. That is, it's harmful for us to depend on one passion's opposing another in order to thwart the latter's effects. So not all agree with this, but Sinot, Bragg, and Clarke do. Okay, and fourth thesis, the passions represent good and evil, which are their objects. And the fifth, on some versions of how the passions are regulated, for instance, Reynolds, reason offers an unsuitable object. Reason offers a suitable object for them to seize upon. On other versions, such as Descartes', the passions misrepresent objects as good or worthy of pursuit, and reason then offers the proper representations of those objects. And then the sixth thesis, is this, that reason and passions are advisors to the will. Thus, reason and passion can be opposed to one another over the direction of our actions. But noticeably absent from this list is the thesis that reason alone without a passion can move us to action. Okay, I realize it's a survey. I could have missed someone, but these are the main thinkers that Hume, I think, would be responding to, and I don't see this thesis that he is arguing against represented in their views. So what was Hume up to? Well, Hume commences his arguments concerning reason and motives in the treatise, in Book 2 of the treatise, by citing the common perspective that I noted in the very beginning of this talk. He makes the following points. He says, first, the prevailing view in philosophy is that our passions are often opposed to our reason in providing motives to actions, and that people are virtuous when they conform their actions to the dictates of reason. Reason is eternal, invariable, and divinely originated, according to this view, while the passions are variable and deceptive. So that's the prevailing view that he wants to work against. Second, this accepted view of motivation and morality, he says, is mistaken on two counts. Because A, he argues reason can never be a motive to any action of the will, and B, reason can never oppose passion in directing the will. Hence, persons cannot be told to regulate their actions according to the dictates of reason and to oppose other forces, since they can't be required to do what's impossible, namely to be moved by reason. As I've shown, the philosophers and theologians writing and sermonizing in the early modern period didn't try to promote the view that reason alone could be a motive to action, and some explicitly argued against it. Yet Hume highlights the error of this thesis, so what did he have in mind? Okay, first I want to say that Hume has a particular characterization of reason that's important to this discussion. Reason, he writes, serves to reveal to us conceptual connections in necessary truth. So a truth like a circle is not a square. It's a necessary truth that we realize through reason. Or reason functions to derive inductive conclusions about the world, like water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. So a large part of Book 1 of the treatise concerns induction or causal reasoning, and there Hume says that all reasonings from cause and effect terminate in conclusions concerning matters of fact, that is, concerning the existence of objects or their qualities. These conclusions are, from the perspective of the person doing the investigation, beliefs. So the products of reason are beliefs, and beliefs have cognitive content. So our beliefs about the world purport to copy our initial experiences and to represent to us the way the world is. Now, in Book 3 of the treatise, where he's discussing the passions, Hume defines reason as the discovery of truth or falsehood, and he defines truth and falsehood as an agreement or disagreement of ideas to real relations of ideas, necessary truths, or to matters of fact. Okay, so that's his characterization of reason. It has those two functions, basically induction and demonstration, or maybe what we'd call deduction, but he talks about demonstration, which involves the use of necessary truths. Okay, now, his characterization of passion is a really interesting one. He says that passions don't make reference to anything beyond themselves. They're original facts and realities. That's the direct quote there, which I actually don't even have in my manuscript, but could read it off here because that's more interesting than reading my rendition of it. He says, passion is an original existence, and it contains not any representative quality, which renders it a copy of any other existence. When I'm angry, I'm possessed with the passion, and in that emotion, I have no more reference to any object than when I'm thirsty, sick, or more than 5 foot high. So, you might look at that and wonder, what is he talking about? Well, he says the passions, they don't copy experiences, they don't contain any content that portrays the world in one way or another. They're just feeling states, according to Hume. It's a controversial view of passions. He doesn't think they represent anything. So he says it's like being a certain height. He actually says it's like, being nauseous when your body is in a certain state. It doesn't make reference to anything. Now, this is controversial. I'll just say, obviously, there are a lot of people who want to argue that passions do represent, because they want to say something like this. When I'm angry at another person, I am representing that person or what they did to me that made me angry. So to say that I'm representing that is to say I'm having an idea of what they did to me. And a lot of philosophers and probably ordinary people would argue that's simply part of the passion. Hume says, no, passions just are feelings. They're just ways of feeling. And they don't represent. So they're totally different from reason, which does give us representations. Reason gives us conclusions, which give us ideas of the way the world is. So, some philosophers have thought that Hume's view on the passions is almost crazy. Annette Beyer called it unfortunate and silly, and Descartes explicitly characterized passions as representations. So that's a huge disagreement between rationalists and empiricists. Well, at least between rationalists and Hume. So, given his characterization of reason and passion, it should be clearer why Hume argued for these two theses, that reason doesn't motivate and reason and passion cannot be opposed. Reason generates no impulses to action. It evaluates representations for truth and falsity. So that means we're unmotivated. We don't feel any push or pull when we engage in reason, or we use rational tuition, or demonstration, or probabilistic reasoning, or induction. And this implies in turn that reason cannot oppose passion for the direction of the will, since only an impulse can oppose an impulse. So envy, anger, benevolence, and so forth, those things can't be opposed to reason. They're impulses, but reason is not an impulse. But to return to the puzzle, why Hume prominently figured the argument that reason without passion does not motivate, I actually entertained three hypotheses. I want to just very briefly give some considerations in favor of the third one. So the first hypothesis is that he simply misunderstood the rationalist views. And it's possible that he did. It's possible that he wasn't familiar with maybe some of the sermons in which it came out that thinkers who, especially Clarke, who sounded as though he was arguing that maybe reason motivates on its own, says in sermons. That's simply not the case. Maybe Hume wasn't familiar with that material. But I don't know if that's the case. It doesn't seem like an interesting answer to the problem, so that's one reason why I'm going to put that aside. The second hypothesis is that Hume defends the thesis that reason isn't a motive because it's a crucial as a sub-argument in the overall case for the conclusion that he draws in Book 3 of the treatise that morality cannot be derived from reason. And it's certainly true that in the treatise, Hume methodically supports his conclusion about morality with premises that reason does not motivate on its own and that morality does motivate on its own. So people try to tell us what we ought not to do in an effort to motivate our behavior. So he thinks that morality does motivate on its own. However, in the second inquiry, the support for that conclusion is more direct. He does reference in the first section of the second inquiry that the goal of moral speculation is to beget habits of virtue and duty. And he does notice that the cool assent of the understanding doesn't have this effect. But in the appendix on moral sentiment in the second inquiry, he emphasizes 5 considerations that point to the conclusion that morality depends on feelings. But none of those considerations references the thesis that reason is not a motive. So I'm going to go ahead and put my second hypothesis aside, and I want to concentrate on the third one for just a few minutes. So the third hypothesis, Hume regards the rationalist view of morality as relying on the thesis that reason alone can motivate, that is, that it can originate motives to action, even if those defending rationalist morality don't acknowledge this commitment or even argue against it. So I'm going to say that he thinks they're committed to this thesis, and I want to explain why. So I think that Hume is doing a reductio ad absurdum. He's trying to show that the rationalists are committed to something that leads to absurdity, even if they don't acknowledge they're committed to it. So how might they be committed by their moral theories to the notion that reason alone can be a motive to action? Well, a lot of the, yes, I guess I neglected to move the slide, but if we accept the rationalist subscription to teleology, which is, the idea that there's a purposeness in the universe, that God has instilled these inclinations for the good in us, that when we make choices that we're tending toward this goodness. That's a teleological view. If we accept the rationalist subscription to teleology, which allows reference to this infused inclination of theological origin to goodness, then these thinkers can trace the source of moral motivation to that proclivity rather than to reason. So they seem to avoid the commitment at stake here at first. Sinnott and Aloff thought that all the passions include this God-instilled proclivity to good and away from evil, and have the potential to be virtues because of that fact. The moderating effect of reason, along with God's grace, can make them worthy motivations. Okay, on Aloff's view, reason reveals to the passions the genuine features of objects, and motivation is initiated by the passions seeking the good, and reason is essential in identifying it. And Bragg's view is similar. The passions are essential to action, but we need reason to show to them the relative worth of goods. The hope is that we'll be moved away from the paltry pleasures of this world and toward the permanent goods of the next. So one question that these intellectuals need to answer is how the passions, which contain an inclination to good and an aversion to evil, can have us act badly when reason's not in control. Perhaps passions sometimes make us misidentify the good by presenting an alternative conception, or perhaps they cause us to latch onto a mistaken idea of it by disrupting deliberation. Either way, however, if having a motive to action is rooted in the original inclination to good, then it looks as though reason need not create a motive to action from scratch. Instead, it presents a conception of the good for us to pursue by a predisposition. So the views from Sinnott, Aloff, and Bragg don't suppose that reason is a motive to action if it's interpreted within their own teleological metaphysics. I also want to say, and I think that in the sake of time, I'm going to skip just a little bit here, but I want to say that both Cudworth and Clarke as well have a kind of view that at first looks like they might avoid a commitment to the motivating effect of reason. The source of error when we go wrong for Cudworth is like that in Descartes' account. It lies in erroneous representations. So the opposition between reason and passion is between representations that originate contrary motivations. In this sense, reason is reputed to motivate, and yet the origin of motivation still ultimately lies in the innate drive for good. Okay. And then I've noted on Clarke's theory of motivation that the will is naturally turned to conforming itself to the fitnesses in the universe of which morality is composed, but it can be corrupted by lust, passions, and self-interest. So Clarke, we have the quintessential picture of the will advised by reason and by passion with the ability to choose freely between them. Okay, now, here's what I say about Hume, though. Hume rejects, obviously, being the great empiricist that he is, he rejects the metaphysical orientation of these philosophers. And he eliminates the idea that human beings are directed by a non-natural force toward goodness. So he would say that reference to divinely instilled inclinations is groundless when the metaphysics is removed. So any theory that purports to account for an intrinsic motive to morality has to found that motivation on the source of morality itself, since there is no justification for appealing to separate motivating states mysteriously and necessarily connected to the comprehension of morality. So in other words, to account for the internal or the necessary connection between morality and the will that thinkers like Aloff, Cudworth, and Clarke believe exists, they have to ground the motivational feature of morality in morality's origin, which they claim to be reason. They all claim it to be reason. So if you remove the metaphysical framework, which of course they want to hang on to, but Hume does not, if you remove the metaphysical framework, these intellectuals believing that morality takes its content from reason and is accessed by reason are also committed to the thesis that reason alone motivates. Now, of course, they wouldn't want to give up the metaphysics, the teleological metaphysics, but Hume would want to undercut that and say, see, this is what you're committed to when we remove your erroneous metaphysics. So this is a suggestion because I'm still, I must admit, quite puzzled about what Hume is up to, but I'm suggesting that Hume's strategy is to show that moral rationalism minus its unjustified references to metaphysics is committed to the false thesis that reason alone is a motive to action, or that it can originate passions that are motives to action. Hume, of course, rejects teleology, for which he substitutes a mechanistic account of the passions and their relation to action. He argues that some rationalists wrongly characterize the passions as representations and that they misunderstand the functions of reason. He maintains that the unruly passions, in fact, can be moderated, but only by other passions. And that's another story how he thinks that happens, but that's exactly what rationalists did not think was the case, that they thought it was dangerous for passions to be to be moderated by other passions. So the rationalist explanation of just how reason is purported to manage the passions and transform their effects, according to Hume, are simply based on false assumptions. So that is my proposal, and I would love to hear comments on whether it seems plausible or not. So thank you.